Hey everyone, this is Andrew, aka Chili Dog here with the Loam Wolf, and today it is new bike day at the Wolf Den. We're gonna be taking a look at this thing. This is the brand new Pivot Firebird. This is their all new Enduro Slayer. I guess I shouldn't say all new, it's an update, and they've packed a whole lot of updates into this bike. So in this video, we're gonna be running through everything that's changed on this bike, everything you need to know, and I'm gonna be giving you my first thoughts of this thing on the trail and how it actually stacks up. So stay tuned for this brand new Enduro Shredder. Now, if you've been following along with Pivot's bike evolution, the Firebird being updated should probably be no surprise. This bike was last updated in 2018, and if you've noticed that the Switchblade and the Mach 6 both now have a vertical shock layout, so it only makes sense that Pivot would then transfer that to their Firebird. Now, since I just brought up those two bikes, I think that's another really interesting thing to talk about, is that as Pivot's lineup has gotten more and more capable, Pivot basically saw a lot of bleed over into the current Firebird that they had. So that bike was very capable, but as the bikes below it and shorter travel kind of got more capable, there started to be less reason for people to buy those, right? When you can have the Switchblade and have it be almost as capable as the current Firebird, what's the point of purchasing one? And so basically what Pivot wanted to do is take a step back and position that bike more carefully in their lineup to be differentiated from their other Enduro level bikes, right? And so what they did was move it closer and align it closer towards the Phoenix DH bike. So this is now even more catered towards gravity riding. So with that said, let's get a little bit more into the geo of this bike because that really explains what's happening and how they're positioning this bike. Now, the old Firebird that is outgoing, the 2018 debut model, has a reach of 475 millimeters, a wheelbase of 1,240, a bottom bracket height of 348 millimeters, a chainstay length of 431, and a head tube angle of 65 degrees. Now, the new Firebird retains the geometry adjustment that's found on the outgoing Firebird. It's gonna be in the same location. It's actually just a very easy to use flip chip on the top of the rear triangle, so you can even do it while riding. As long as you have a multi-tool, you can make that adjustment. So in the new bike on the low position, you're gonna see a reach angle of 488 millimeters, an effective top tube length of 641 millimeters, an effective seat tube angle of 77 degrees, a stack height 636 millimeters, a wheelbase of 1,267 millimeters, a bottom bracket height of 350 millimeters, a chainstay of 438 millimeters, and a head tube angle of 64 degrees. Now, for those of you that don't speak bike nerd, basically what's happening here is that the Pivot Firebird from the previous generation has gotten a little bit more centralized in the rider position. So in the previous bike, you noticed that there was a little bit shorter chainstay in the back, a little bit shorter reach angles. Based on feedback from their team riders that were racing EWS, basically Pivot saw a need to make this bike a little bit faster and a little bit more catered towards hammering in high-speed situations. As the tracks have gotten gnarlier, they're actually finding that a lot of EWS races are sharing track sections with World Cup downhill tracks. And so at that point, this bike basically needs to be able to handle the same terrain as the Phoenix, but still climb to the top. And so with that in mind, they basically made a more centralized rider position on the bike. Now in the previous Firebird, one of the big things that stands out is the chainstay length, right? So that bike had a 431 millimeter chainstay. The new bike bumps that up to 438 in the size large. That combined with a longer reach really centers the rider more on the bike. And what happens when you center the rider more on the bike is you get a more confident feeling situation when you're going at high speed. So if you're plowing over rocks, you're absolutely going all out, that is where the bike is gonna feel extremely confident and extremely composed. That said, it is a little bit less nimble, a little bit less agile, but what you're trading is for stability at speed, and this bike definitely has that. Now, speaking of geometry, it's actually worth noting that Pivot does something fantastic with their bikes that a lot of other brands skip on, and that is that they have size-specific geometry the entire way through the lineup. So I'm 6'3". I'm at the taller end of the spectrum, and what I really appreciate about this is that Whether someone is on a small size frame or a large or an extra large, I personally chose to ride a large for this bike, you're able to get a tuned riding setup for your height. So what that means is basically they're catering all the geometry numbers to have the bike have the similar feel all the way across the line. And this is way more expensive, right? Because they have to have more tooling, more molds. They have to redo the rear triangle for every one of these bikes, but that's gonna make a huge difference for rider feel on the bike. So regardless of whether you are 6'4" or 5'1", you're gonna have a very similar feeling on the bike. Now let's talk suspension. So we talked a little bit about in the beginning that this bike had new redesigned suspension with a vertical linkage layout. It's still gonna be using the familiar DW Link suspension. And so what's nice about that is that you're balancing really good pedaling efficiency with great bump absorption. I'll touch on that later once I get into the riding feedback on this bike, but this is gonna be carrying that same thing over. Now the reason why Pivot went with a vertical shock layout was a complaint that a lot of people had on the outgoing version of the Firebird, which is that the front triangle had no room for a water bottle, no room for supplies, no room for tools. And so with this new version, you get access to all of that. In fact, Pivot actually set this up so that you can have their tool setup on the top tube, you can have a live valve on the bike, and you can have a full-size water bottle in the front triangle. As far as build specs go, Pivot offers 3 basic build levels. They have the race, the pro, and the team. Now, if you actually look at the build charts on their site, it seems like they have a ton of bike offerings, and that's because they're really doing a good job of fine-tuning and catering those 3 different build levels. So within those build levels, this is what's actually really cool, is that you have the ability to do SRAM or Shimano spec at any one of those levels. So unlike most brands where you're kind of pigeonholed into going up or down a level of bike, if you want a certain drivetrain, with Pivot, you can actually get a SRAM or Shimano drivetrain all the way across the board. So whatever preference you have, whatever budget you can have the drivetrain and brake setup that you want. Now, speaking of budget, the prices range from $6,000 to $13,000. So there isn't any necessarily budget-friendly option within the Pivot lineup. But that said, the $6,000 range is gonna get you a bike that's literally ready to race that weekend. So you can buy a bike on Friday, race it on Sunday. Now, the other options they offer within the builds are actually in the rear shock and suspension. So like most brands, they offer different levels of suspension depending on the price, but they're also gonna offer an air and coil spec in the rear shock. And then in the higher end builds, you have the option for Fox live valve. So no matter what your preference is there between air, coil, or doing the live valve suspension for a really potent setup, you have those options in their build sheets. They also have different wheel options, so you can go with either aluminum or carbon. The test bike that you see here is with their carbon wheels, the air shock spec, and full Shimano build from front to back. Finally, Pivot also offers 2 colorways. They have the glacial green metallic, which is what you see here, and they have a bright orange colorway that's gonna be in a lot of their press material, matches with the Fox lineup, and it's a really, really cool looking colorway if you like something bright and poppy. Now we're gonna have full detailed build specs on our website, so if there's something I didn't cover that you wanna know, feel free to head over to theloamwolf.com and you can check out the full build list. But with the boring stuff out of the way, let's get into how this bike actually handles on the trail. I've only had this bike for about 2 weeks, so I haven't had a ton of time to ride this bike, but I've been able to do a bunch of secret missions to some local steep trails here in Southern California. And one of the things that I was really curious about when I pulled this bike out of the box was seeing how Pivot dealt with the balance of making a bike that isn't so catered at downhill riding that it ends up alienating some of their customer base that has to ride flatter trails to get there. So I made sure to actually test this bike on some more boring flat trails because I was really curious how it would handle for those of us that aren't racing EWS, right? Because this is a bike that if you're buying as a consumer, you're probably gonna do some more chill rides and you're gonna do some more intense stuff. So I was curious how it would stack up on all of that. Despite this bike essentially having the geo of a full-fledged DH bike, it does pedal exceptionally well. I have to say, I've been really impressed so far with my time on it at how efficiently it pedals. Despite having almost no pedal bob, this thing still eats up a little chatter, small bumps, so it's still sensitive, but there's no pedal bob. And that's really a factor of the DW Link suspension and the kinematics that Pivot put into it. But of course, climbing is not where the Firebird was meant to be. And so when you point this bike downhill, that's where this thing really shines. Pivot's always had a very stiff, responsive frame, and coupled with the carbon Reynolds wheels on this bike, it was incredibly snappy, incredibly stiff in corners. That said, it still had enough compliance when you got into a rut or something where the bike wanted to kind of skirt around stuff. It was able to do that. It wasn't so stiff that it just beat you up to pieces, but it had all the snappiness that you want torsionally to get out of a corner, to kind of direct the bike and move it around and get it to where you want it to on the trail. I will say though that this is a long bike, so if you have tight switchbacks, things like that, you had to do stoppies to get around him. You had to kind of put in a little bit more body English because it's just a big bike. So this is gonna be best suited for wide open, fast, gnarly technical trails. Pivot has a fantastic lineup of other bikes like the Mach 6, like the Switchblade, that are gonna be a little bit more compact. So if you don't have riding that really warrants a bike this aggressive, there's plenty of other options from Pivot if you like their DW Link suspension, if you like the ethos of their brand. That said, if you're someone that's looking to hard charge, hit big jumps, do gnarly technical trails, stuff that is extremely steep and basically bred for a downhill bike, that's where this Firebird shines. And really, as a consumer, I see very little reason to ever get a downhill bike with bikes this capable on the market, right? I can pedal myself to the top of the local downhill trail and then ride down just as well as I could on a pretty much full-fledged DH bike. And so there's a lot to be said for that. I think it's pretty crazy how far bikes have evolved. You know, when the 2018 version of the Firebird came out, that was really kind of the first time that we were seeing these ultra aggressive 29er enduro bikes. Now, these bikes seem to be just kind of the norm. And so this Firebird generation is gonna be even taking it further than that and making an extremely capable bike. It really does show that Pivot cares. And I think that's what's cool about Pivot as a brand, is that they're guys that ride. They know the spec, and so they're not gonna shortchange you on a junky shifter. They're not gonna shortchange you on a bad rear shock spec. Most of the stuff that they're putting on these bikes, and you'd hope so at a $6,000 entry level price point, is literally going to be race ready. And that's really what you're seeing on this bike here, is a bike that you can pull out of the box and not change a single part on. So look, this thing is a potent machine. It is very targeted at a specific use case, and that is riders that are looking to go as fast as possible while still being able to pedal to the top. The G numbers on this bike don't lie. It has a 64-degree head tube angle, so if you're someone that's doing casual riding, this is not the bike for you. If you're someone that likes to do a ton of bike park, extremely steep stuff, this is gonna be the bike for you. And I'm really excited to get this thing out in some more bike park laps, get it in some really technical situations now that it's out and available to the public, and I can actually be seen in public on this thing. Very excited to get some more lap time on this thing and some steeper trails where it really belongs. So we're gonna be doing a full review of this bike in the coming months, long-term review to actually show how it is shaken down, but I wanna give you guys my personal thoughts on how this thing has stacked up so far. So let us know what you think of this bike. Leave a comment down below. Tell us what you think of this bike, if you would own one, if enduro bikes should be this big, this long, and this burly, or if it's getting too much in the downhill terrain. I'm actually curious what you guys think. So thank you guys so much. Chili Dog signing off, and please don't forget to hit subscribe. Catch you on the next Loam video.